All right, I will be short and sweet. I know we're getting a little tight on time now. So my name is Rhys. I am a senior open source analyst for a company called Novetta. We are based in the McLean area here in Virginia. I support the National Institutes of Health and their Ebola studies that we started in Liberia and are now in the Democratic Republic of Congo. My company is primarily DoD facing, and I had the really fortunate opportunity to use some of these really high-powered, well-funded tools in a humanitarian sense, and we've really made a lot of significant progress in doing so. So just before I get into kind of how we do it, we first started at the tail end of the Ebola outbreak in Liberia, where the NIH wanted to do Ebola studies there, a series of studies that went on for about 3 years, but they were concerned about the public sentiment around Ebola in general. Kind of, would people even show up for these studies? Are they going to put a lot of resources and money into a program that won't have any participation and therefore a study that's not successful? So we did ground assessment. We used a field team and also look into any kind of open source data we can get from broadcast, print media, social media, all the way down to local leaflets that we can find in communities. So we worked there for 3 years. By the end of it, the kind of public perception of the Prevail Ebola study program was high enough that we transitioned to the DRC as that outbreak picked up, and I'll get into that in a little bit. So just to give a kind of overview of how we do it, in general, we're media analysis, but that term media is getting, I think, a little more blurry recently, especially with a lot of these new apps popping up. But we look, again, print, broadcast, social media, and kind of local media we can get our hands on. We process it by putting in our own metadata. So we have a human curation that's tied into machine learning that allows us to really take in a vast quantity of data and do it rapidly. So we can assign these little intricacies to what we pull in. And that looks like, a certain newspaper article, we'll pull a few quotes, well, all the quotes from that article. We assign source, sentiment, location, and topic. So over time, we build a pretty comprehensive database that allows us to see who's saying what, how they're saying it, look at specific groups or citizens pro this or pro that, and it really gives us good insight into when certain individuals that have a lot of power in the media speak about a certain subject, how that's going to be disseminated and then reflected by citizens later on. We provide weekly output reports to the NIH to kind of help their community engagement teams on the ground know what's coming, making sure they're not missing certain pieces of information, and knowing kind of when to stay away from others. So really get around some of those obstacles and working with communities in the middle of an Ebola outbreak. So this is kind of our platform that we're able to visualize all this data. By putting all this together, we're able to see both long-term trends, which have become invaluable, and kind of rapid reaction pieces. So when damaging misinformation comes out, or in the case of the DRC, quite often security threats pop up, we're able to identify them right away and let our teams on the ground know this is what you're facing. Either evacuate the area or be prepared to talk about this when you enter these communities. And we had a really significant win in the DRC that really is also was supported really well by the software group at Novetta as well. I was able to, working with my field team, access WhatsApp channels. And the significance of that was there was primarily misinformation on Facebook when we first started in the DRC in February of 2019. But a lot of criticism popped up about that, and those community conversations where people were kind of speaking freely and talking about Ebola response personnel, the MSF, WHO, how they wanted, there was a lot of backlash that started picking up as more attention was paid to this misinformation on Facebook. And towards a few months later, everybody was really proud of how they had moved away from the misinformation on Facebook, but we found it actually transferred onto WhatsApp, where they were private channels and no one could really tell them what to do. Working with our field team, we were able to access these channels and sit down and watch these conversations happen in local communities that don't happen in a survey. They don't happen when you go out and approach communities and want to talk about specific subjects. So, there's posts about everything from the local soccer team to Donald Trump being the local hero, oddly enough, in the DRC, and all the way to Ebola content. So we don't just look at Ebola content in a silo. We're seeing what everyone's talking about in the media across the board. And a lot of times we would see frustrations with the WHO or MSF as to why people didn't know information or that it hasn't gotten out there when they've been broadcasting on the radio and things like that, because people didn't care. There were security issues going on where many people are dying in their communities from rebel attacks, that Ebola is not really an issue. Even other healthcare issues were more important at times. So it really helped us give context to what we were looking at and what we needed to approach when you can't keep jamming these communication efforts into communities that don't want to hear about Ebola anymore. So it really helped us kind of contextualize that as we went forward. So kind of snapshot of some of the stuff we do with misinformation. We're able to identify kind of where this stuff comes from and track it through the different media sources. So we're cross-referencing radio to WhatsApp to Facebook to local print. And a lot of times where people keep talking about WhatsApp or Facebook being the source of the misinformation, it's not really true in a lot of cases where they're a little further away from highly densely populated areas where radio stations kind of get some information about what's going on, but not everything. So they get on their broadcast and they fill in those gaps. And it's from those pieces of information that aren't quite accurate, but they're close to the other information that we see a lot of this kind of rumor mill build. And that information is taken onto WhatsApp and Facebook, and it's spread rapidly. And so because we're doing this cross-referencing, as we've kind of looked back into some of our historical data, we've identified where these sources are, who are the most prominent ones starting this misinformation, and how to work backwards and approach those rumors at its source and move on from there. So I have a few case studies just to really drive home the point, I guess. So in June, we came across this story on WhatsApp where it really gave a real-world example as to how damaging misinformation can be, especially on the front lines of an epidemic or something as tricky as an Ebola outbreak in a war-torn area. So there wasn't a lot of trust towards international responders in the first place, but the information was not getting to local communities as fast as it should, or a lot of communities didn't want to hear it. So there was an ongoing rumor that once someone died of Ebola, the response teams would harvest their organs and send them back to the United States for a multitude of reasons. Came out of that strange line, but it got so intense that people were raiding the morgues to bring their family members home so they didn't lose their organs and they could actually pass on to the afterlife that they felt appropriate because their body was intact. Should the organs be removed, that wouldn't happen. So in this specific example, a man, his brother died. He and a few friends went and took the body out of the morgue. They were chased by the police. They discarded the body, but they had all come in contact with it, and then they dispersed in their communities. So now, Ebola contact, moving into a community. This was right before a really large spike in Ebola cases in the DRC, and this is something that we pass on to our response team saying, hey, this is something you need to pay attention to. First of all, we need to address this information, but be ready for increased cases as well. And because we don't take this information in a silo, we look at every kind of subject that we can, we've stumbled onto a really intricate security situation as well. And I'm sure a lot of you have heard about the insecurity in the area, but that long-term trend analysis, we were able to start to identify when messaging became a little more aggressive in social media channels or even on the radio, specifically on the radio, that it was more likely for an imminent attack, whether it be negative messaging to international responders. It's probably going to be a treatment center. Towards the UN, they were going after a UN facility. Even though it was not always direct messaging that came out of that, we started to see that these spikes came before an attack, and then after an attack, they quickly dropped. The final one is one of these events. The misinformation about a multitude of things that the international responders were doing was pretty strong, but as they moved into different communities, the messaging didn't really change. Whatever they were saying in Benny City, as they moved into a smaller region and set up another treatment center, they didn't really adapt to the local narrative to address kind of local beliefs as much. And quite often we saw issues like this where the new communities get all the negativity from operating facilities in different regions that have kind of a wider following or are pushing content in WhatsApp or Facebook. And so they're getting a lot of this misinformation with no real verification, and then a team walking into their community and setting up a treatment center in the middle of town led to a lot of confrontation. And this, fortunately for us, was quite often shared on WhatsApp. There's somewhat of a gentleman's code for Congolese that the rebels will even share or post this flyer saying we're going to be here tomorrow and attack. So we don't really want to injure anybody, but we're definitely going to burn down this building. So please leave. And it serves as a great warning, but it gave us a lot of insight into what resistance in these communities can lead to, and more importantly, how much misinformation can impact the work people were doing. So the biggest lessons we learned were identifying these media narratives early and being prepared going into these communities to understand the local perception was vital in both Liberia and the DRC, more specifically the DRC. And then the feedback loop of when community engagement happens. So doing an initial assessment, knowing that these issues are going to be confrontational, and on the back end, after the community engagement happens, reassessing and saying, hey, this was positive, this worked here, use these pieces here, and it's going to be different somewhere else, but at least we know how to be successful in one location. And then understanding the changes over time, like I said, were really useful in kind of finding out where we needed to start paying attention. And more importantly, for a lot of these NGOs or groups working in outbreak response is knowing where to allocate resources. There's not a ton of money right off the bat. It's got to get really bad to get the money in there. So knowing when to approach, knowing who's important enough to approach, keeping that as a standard really helps people put resources in the right way and not spend money in a way that is going to slow down response mechanisms as it continues on. And I think I went over time, and I apologize. So that's all. Thank you.